Hello, fellow humans. Chris here again. So today, as promised, I have a very special interview lined up. Esteemed guest, I'm very uh, appreciative of you being here with me today. This is a researcher, philosopher, award-winning author of Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think, Andy Norman. Andy, thank you very much for being here with me today.
Thank you, Chris. It's nice to be here.
As you and I have been talking a little bit the last couple months about different ideas. I read your book. I loved your book. I actually stumbled on your book in my own research for a documentary that I'm working on. So you came to my mind because you're aware of the recent sort of controversy with Joe Rogan and Spotify.
Yes.
And I thought of you because I know that you were actually on his podcast a while back, which in and of itself is actually kind of a huge deal. He's got like 12 million subscribers on YouTube. So
yeah, it was I have to say I'm grateful to Joe for having me on his show, and to the extent that that makes me a non-objective participant in this conversation, everyone should take what I have to say with a grain of salt.
Sure. And that's fair of you to say that. And I'm sorry, my full disclosure is you may be taking a slight step down from Joe Rogan today. I don't have quite the same reach.
Oh, but, I don't know. Reach isn't the only important consideration.
True. So yes, I wanted to reach out to you because I felt that I don't really watch a lot of Joe Rogan, but I kind of hear some of the clips, some of the more inflammatory, controversial clips that they play, and he did a video response to the controversy. And that's kind of what I wanted to focus on with you, because I felt that a lot of what you talk about in your book that I really like is not just about the right thing, not just about what's factually correct, but how to think and how to sort of navigate the different things we hear in the media and other platforms. And I really felt his response to me kind of felt like a non-apology apology, where he's sort of absolving himself of the responsibility and saying, look, I'm not an expert. I'm just having a conversation. And I wanted to have some people who had differing opinions, which on the surface sounds fair enough. But you look at his reach, his 12 million subscribers. And I guess I wanted to ask you, what point do you have a certain responsibility to kind of get it right?
Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating and important topic, especially given the age we're entering, where some people have huge influence and the capacity to influence millions of people's points of view. So let me back up a step. I mean, I wrote a book called Mental Immunity, and it's all about how we can think more responsibly and become less prone to mistaken ideas by using some of the tools that both the sciences and philosophy have unearthed for spotting and removing problematic assumptions and ideas. So that's where that's the work that brought me on to Joe's show. And I have to say, I think he was a perfect gentleman. He was very gracious when I was there. We had a lot of fun discussing my book over the course of 3+ hours. And Joe's very good at finding common ground with his guests. And I think one of the things conversation is for carving out that such common ground. So I credit him with exemplifying the art of listening and learning from other people and trying to find points of agreement. I think that's a really important talent that he has, and that he's doing the world a service by sharing it. And there's something deeply problematic about giving a platform to science denialists and conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones. Right. So the particular controversy that you're referencing cropped up when the musician Neil Young decided to withdraw from Spotify in protest of Rogan's having platformed two COVID denying scientists, one
Yes.
Dr. Peter McCullough and two Robert Malone.
Right.
Now, I have not listened to Malone's and McCullough's episodes on Rogan. I trust the scientists who say that these guys are not representing the facts fairly and honestly or accurately. And I think Joe himself is beginning to understand that it's very problematic to give a huge platform to people like that.
Right.
So I guess I'll start off with this kind of statement about where I sit on this. I think Joe means well. And I think he's been a little bit slow to understand the huge influence he's gained.
Mm-hmm.
He gained that influence simply by inviting people onto a show and talking to them, which in and of itself is a very, very fine thing. And it grew into something that even he doesn't quite comprehend. And I watched his video apology. So his response to the Neil Young Spotify controversy was to apologize for the mistakes he's made and to say that he would try to do better. Mm-hmm. And he said he would try to do better by making that as you mentioned, he basically said he likes to get many different points of view, lots of different opinions on the show, and that he thought the way to address that might be to have more people with the opposite point of view.
Right.
And that's, I think you've put your finger on the place where this is problematic, because if you simply present both sides of a factual or scientific question, and one of those guests is a real scientist who takes his responsibilities to the evidence seriously, and the other side, and the representative of the other side is not equally scrupulous, is not equally honest, then you create a false equivalence in people's minds, encouraging many people to think that COVID denialism is just as good as belief in COVID and belief in the vaccines.
Sure.
So I share your qualms about Joe, and I don't think his video apology was a bad faith evasion. I think it was an honest, good faith attempt to come to terms with it, but I think he could move further in the direction you're suggesting.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points there. I think I agree with you that I do think I think it's a good faith position. I know people personally in my life that are kind of like a Joe Rogan. And as you said, if I have friends that I disagree with on some issues, some of them fairly big issues, but I can still maintain a good, we don't let it get personal. And I think that I agree with that. I think Joe Rogan is that way. But also, like you said, there's a little bit of a problem with, it's almost like he's this sort of kid who's got his own lemonade stand and like doesn't know what to do with it. There's an old friend of mine. We were, when COVID stuff started, and then when some of the things with Trump were getting kind of heated, he was talking about how, in the old days, you'd have some crazy guy with a sign saying something and he's standing on a corner, and that's his platform, and just people, all right, that's the crazy guy in the corner. But now, I mean, I didn't have to do much to make this YouTube channel. It's not that hard to reach a lot of people, I mean, around the world. And that's kind of gets into what you talked about with the responsibility that somebody like a Joe Rogan has. And I would say, I'm glad that you mentioned that you think he has a good faith, because I agree. And I don't want this to come off as like we're just picking on Joe Rogan specifically. He just happens to have a really big platform. And so there are obviously, like you mentioned, Alex Jones. I mean, there's definitely people who are much more intentionally inflammatory. But I do think it's interesting to get into the that sort of false equivalency. Like, is he taking those people off the corner and putting them up next to like like a Bernie Sanders or something, and acting like those are two of the same, same thing, or opposite sides of the same coin when they're not.
Yeah. Well, I think I think that's a legitimate criticism, something that Joe could listen and learn from. I think it's important to be able to create a collaborative conversation space where you build common ground, even with people who have very different points of view. And Joe does that very well.
Right.
And it's also important once you've established that common ground to begin testing the ideas that are really genuinely questionable and calling attention to their defects so that we know not to take them too seriously. And I'm not aware that Joe is as good as that. I think he could have a hugely positive impact on the world by adding his own skill set, adding to a skill set in that dimension.
Right.
Yeah.
There's
so I don't always think he does some guests. So if I were in his shoes, I wouldn't even provide a platform to people like Alex Jones or Peter McCullough.
Right.
But if I did, I would be very well prepared to challenge the views that the scientific community says are bunk.
Right.
Rather than let them pass by with relatively little critical scrutiny. I think certainly it's certainly true when you have a platform Joe's size, that you have a responsibility to your audience and to the larger world to do something like that.
And the ironic thing about that, though, is part of, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, part of Joe Rogan's allure, I think, is that he is very conversational. He's very much like just a guy that you'd be having a beer with in the backyard and just saying whatever comes to your mind. And I think people do like that. And I guess, maybe it would hurt his brand for him to be better, because I know, based on just reading some of the comments on some of his videos, there's some uneducated people that really love him because he speaks his mind. I mean, people thought that about Donald Trump also. You kind of alluded to it. Is there a number, like when you have this many followers, you need to start doing your homework, or is it just sort of a way of thinking that we should all kind of ascribe to?
Yeah, I think we have responsibilities with regard to what we think and say, even if we never even get an audience of one. If you're your own audience,
right,
you have a responsibility to try to get it right.
Mm-hmm.
Now that doesn't mean that if you do your best and get it wrong, that I'm going to point fingers and cast negative judgments on you.
Sure.
But I do think it's important, especially in this highly connected age, that we all do our best to spot and remove the problematic ideas. And by problematic, I mean false, I mean inflammatory, I mean likely to confuse people. There are many different ways in which ideas can be problematic.
Right.
And we need to be sensitive to all of them. So for example, if I say something that's technically true, but guaranteed to inflame violent passions, I would not call that responsible speech, right? So I think there are probably several dimensions along which we can assess claims and ideas, and that the most responsible and the wisest people among us pay attention to all of them and are constantly on the lookout for indications that their ideas might be problematic in one way or another.
Right.
I'm a philosopher by training, and I'm a big fan of the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. And what Socrates was just masterful at was just listening really well, asking clarifying questions, and then patiently drawing attention to the problematic features of ideas simply by asking follow-up questions.
Right.
And when you do that, when you engage in that kind of conversation with people, you start to become more and more sensitive to ideas' defects. And you're less likely to rely on them overmuch.
Right.
So I think in some ways the solution to our wacky post-truth world is for all of us to learn from Socrates' example and learn how to use clarifying questions, and in some cases, critical follow-up questions to try to weed out the stuff that's likely to spread misinformation or confuse or harm people.
That's kind of a good segue into one part in particular that you and I had talked with before regarding your book. There was a part in your book here. Let's see if I can pull the specific. Well, I can kind of paraphrase it anyway, but it was a chapter on 6 immune disruptive ideas, and you basically, I liked it because it kind of in a nutshell, it's basically saying, okay, yeah, maybe everybody has the right to their opinion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to respect it. And a few of them in particular that I thought kind of spoke to this topic was you had one that was, we have the right to believe what we like. One was, we have no standing to criticize others' value judgments. And one was, basic value commitments are not subject to rational assessment. And I really like those because they really tap into that idea that the kind of antithesis to rational thought being that, hey man, you can't, like, if that guy, that's his opinion, he can have his opinion, and who are we, or who am I to judge that, right? So that's kind of those are the things we need to start being, not being afraid to kind of call out our friends and family, even if they might maybe be kind of missing something.
Yeah, I'll elaborate on that a bit if you like, because I think this is something I'm quite proud of having, gained a little bit of clarity about and written about in the book. So bad information can spread in kind of a viral fashion from mind to mind. And the question is, how do you inoculate your own mind? How do you build up your mind's defenses so that it can spot and filter out the bad stuff? Scientists have learned that the mind's information filtration system, it actually behaves like the body's immune system.
Right.
So the body's immune system will generate antibodies to fight off a pathogen, and the mind will generate doubts and questions to fight off questionable or problematic information, if you're using it properly.
Right.
So you have to learn to listen to that little voice in your head that says, something's not quite right here. That doesn't quite square with other things I know. Or, I'm not so sure that's accurate, or I'm not so sure that's wise. If you make a habit of asking those questions, you become more sensitive to ideas' problematic features, and you're more likely to call them out. And nobody likes somebody who just runs around criticizing everything they say. And in fact, residents of ancient Athens sentenced Socrates to death because he was such a vociferous critic of their unexamined opinions. There are gentle, affirming, collaborative ways to help people see that they might want to rethink things. And we need to learn how to do it in ways that don't make us enemies of one another.
Sure. I guess the challenge is that, you sort of alluded to the idea of it's almost like a use it or lose it sort of thing. Like you can build up your mental immunity by sort of teaching yourself to ask those questions and not necessarily take everything that you hear. But at the same time, you go a certain, especially if you're indoctrinated with certain beliefs as a young child, then they really become ingrained. And do you like go over the top to try to correct that, or do you have to do it in subtle ways? Because as you said, you have to you kind of have to tread a fine line, because you don't want to have people not want to associate with you anymore.
That's right. And of course, the ideas that people take to heart and integrate into their sense of identity, those are the really tricky ones to question, because people feel threatened.
Right.
So if your beliefs are part of who you are, or they feel like they're like a necessary part of who you are, then if I came along and questioned them, you're likely to get angry. And
Right.
this is true of all of us. But what some of the wisest people in the world have advised is not to get attached to your beliefs. We don't have to identify with our beliefs. In fact, an alternative that I point to in the book is you can identify instead with the process of inquiry, the process of honest searching for the truth, and have particular outcomes of that search be tentative resting places that you might later have to rethink.
Right.
So the wisest people in the world, in my view, when I've had the luxury of studying, some marvelously talented philosophers for about 30 years, that they all say that this is the right way to conduct your cognitive affairs. And to come back to the immune disruptive ideas. So this process of filtering ideas by asking questions is like an immune system, like an immune response. But if you don't do it right, it'll let in lots of bad ideas and screen out lots of good ones, and you don't want that. So it turns out that the idea, I have a right to believe what I want, I have a right to my opinions, is shuts down the mind's immune system. So if you use that to excuse your uneducated opinions, you might gain yourself a little bit of protection from critical questions, but you're undermining your own best interests in the long run.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I argue that in our culture, the idea that everyone is entitled to their opinion is almost an orthodoxy. Almost everybody, left and right, think that that's true, because there's a sense in which we want to treat, because it's true that we have a legal right to our opinion, but that doesn't mean we have a moral right to any old opinion that we happen to have.
Right. And it's interesting, as I think this topic, this kind of gets into another section of your book also, where you talked about it's okay for us to have certain established values. Like there are objective moral, like we all agree. I mean, us normal people, I guess, we agree that murder is wrong and we shouldn't kill other people. And I think we can agree that that's something that we don't really need to discuss that issue any further. And I think that while that seems like a fairly obvious one, I think the overarching point there is that it's okay to say, no, this is the truth. Like there's that fine line, as you said, with letting people have their beliefs, but sort of giving people equal weight for something that really is kind of demonstrably false does have some problems.
Yeah, I like to say that every person deserves respect, but not every opinion deserves respect.
Yeah.
There are many and I mean, maybe, and it's possible that even a completely irresponsible opinion deserves to be listened to politely and responded to with a measured tone of voice, because that's the best way to help wean somebody off of a mistaken idea. But look, the idea that the earth is flat is not as good as the idea that the earth is round. It's just not. It's false.
Right.
It's delusional. It's mistaken. It's flies in the face. It's irresponsible. And the same is true of many, many, many factual beliefs. And because no one of us can become an expert on any more than a fraction of these things. We have to rely on others to investigate these things for us. And this is one of the real beauties of science, is that there's a division of labor, and experts in very narrow domains go really deep, and they develop very accurate and precise understandings of these things. And for the most part, scientists know to respect the opinions of other experts. And so cosmologists accept what the immunologists tell them, and the chemists accept what the geologists tell them. That's not unthinking blind faith in one another. That's a smart, educated trust in
Right.
a process that is genuinely reliable. Now, science makes mistakes, but it's more reliable than any other belief fixation method or belief determination method we've ever hit upon as a species.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And you know, as you said, science is always growing and evolving. And I think one of the byproducts, unfortunately, sort of on the other side here is, um, again, sort of backtracking to that sort of equal weight on two conflicting ideas. Um, People, like, even in Joe Rogan's response, he had mentioned that, which actually wasn't factually correct either, but he had mentioned that, 8 months ago, you could have said, if you had said that the vaccines, that if you get a vaccine, you could still spread COVID, you'd been banned from social media, which is completely untrue. First, I mean, nobody has ever actually said, I mean, nobody in a position of educational authority has ever said getting a vaccine is going to 100% stop you from getting or passing on COVID. It's about lessening the risk. But he creates this false pretense like, okay, see, the science has changed, which that part is true. The science does change, like you said. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't go along with it. It's kind of almost like analogous to, people talk about, like, in politics, like a flip-flopper, and obviously, like, flip-flopping on issues purely for political reasons that's one thing. But if you get new information, you kind of do have a responsibility to maybe change your thinking on something. I've certainly had issues that I felt one way about, and then I actually, when COVID first started, I actually wasn't that worried about it. For the very beginning of it, I thought, okay, it's going to just blow over. But then I very quickly learned that, okay, this is going to stick around for a while.
And to me, that's represents an admirable ability to learn from experience, and we should all aspire to, I think, be similar. Now, I myself harbored many false ideas about viruses and vaccines at the start of the pandemic. Um, my mental model of vaccination was that, once you're immunized against smallpox, you will never ever get smallpox. Or once you're immunized against chickenpox, you'll never ever get chickenpox again. Right. Well, it turns out that it's not that cut and dry.
Right.
Right. And this all became very personal because shortly after the pandemic began, well, I guess this was mid-pandemic, my mother was admitted into a old age home where she had to isolate. And we, her children, who she desperately needed for companionship, weren't allowed in for fear that we might spread the virus to her. And I remember getting very hot under the collar and heated in some of my conversations with the hospital administrators, saying, sure, she needs our company because she's really suffering right now. And frankly, you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to the vaccine. Well, it turns out I was wrong about some of the things I had assumed about the
right.
virus. So I had some egg on my face there from having gone with my best understanding, and then later learned that, actually people who understand this far better than I do would not have agreed with me. So I had to change my mind.
Well, I'm sorry that you had to go through that. I will say that I think if there was ever a situation where you deserve a pass, I think that would qualify. Obviously, that's an admirable thing to try to be there for your mother. And, I obviously you would try to do whatever you could to do that. And as you said, with my example, you did change your thinking once you came across the correct information. So yeah,
well,
I think,
and the hospital administrator, or the old age home administrators, they listened to what people like me were saying, and they right. amended their policies as well. There was give on both sides.
Right. So I know that this isn't something that there's just one catch-all solution to, but the reason why I had reached out to you initially a few months back was because I am also working on this sort of side project, and the documentary is kind of, without getting too much into the weeds, it's sort of exploring kind of the last 3 or 4 years. And I really wanted to kind of focus on the January 6th insurrection as well. And what led, because obviously that was an example of a very serious, tangible effect of very, very warped thinking by people that all the evidence they needed was a president saying, hey, this was a scam. And obviously we see the indications in other areas of the world as well, where flawed thinking can lead to detrimental, serious outcomes. Is there a solution to that, or is it just something that is just going to snowball and get worse and worse?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to wake up and acknowledge things like not all speech is morally permissible. I mean, maybe we don't want to crack down on irresponsible speech using the full force of the law. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't use other forms of deterrence and sanction. I mean, it seems to me that if you stop listening to a podcast that consistently airs irresponsible views, that's a permissible way to push back against it, right? And there are many other, I mean, it's okay to criticize. That's a reasonable form of pushback.
Right.
And not all criticism amounts to censorship. We can't conflate those. I think actually that satire and irony and ridicule and shaming all have roles to play in curtailing the spread of mis and disinformation. It's not always the nicest thing to do, but sometimes it's the right thing to do.
Right. And you brought up censorship, which I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another one of those things. You look at Twitter, for example. Obviously, Twitter banned Donald Trump, and so did Facebook. And he and many others would classify that incorrectly as censorship, which, censorship. I mean, I studied media in college, and censorship has to do with the government taking over, which that absolutely goes against the First Amendment. But ironically, to say that Twitter has no right to censor Donald Trump is actually going against Twitter's constitutional rights.
Well, I would use, to make your argument even stronger, I wouldn't use the word censor there in the last part. I would say Twitter's right to withdraw its platform from Donald Trump. Right. I know you agree with the spirit of this, but in other words, there's a difference between censoring and deplatforming. And some deplatforming is genuinely problematic. I mean, sometimes a controversial speaker will be booked at a university, and other students who oppose that person's message will have a fit and basically throw kind of a collective tantrum and end up getting that speaker's invitation revoked.
Right.
I'm not a fan of that kind of deplatforming, and there are some examples of it that I detest. But it does seem to me that Twitter and Facebook did the right thing when they said, you know what, Donald Trump's record, his irresponsible use of speech is now so thoroughly documented that we can no longer afford him access to this very huge soapbox that we've been lending him all this time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the gist of what I wanted to talk about. I did want to ask you if you had any other projects in the coming up, like any more books that I can look out for, or any other appearances that we can look for you in.
Kind of you to ask. I wish I had time to be working on the next book right now. That's had to take a back seat. Look, the last book, Mental Immunity, it's been almost a year now since it came out, has generated so many interesting possibilities. I've founded a research institute to bring together all of the top researchers who are kind of thinking about how we can combat misinformation and disinformation. And we're going to work together to sketch out better strategies for preventing corrosive untruths from destabilizing democratic societies and harming our collective lot. So there's an international institution. In fact, nations all over the world are concluding that it is becoming really, really hard to maintain a stable democratic society in the age of social media. We can't just resign ourselves to that and watch while vitriolic online exchanges tear us apart. We need to find solutions to this. So along with other people who do research in this field, we're actually devising solutions that can actually help to strengthen our mind's resistance to mis and disinformation.
I hope that is able to stick. I hope that that's able to kind of pick up steam, because that's certainly important. Yeah, that's amazing. It's almost kind of akin to climate change, where there's unfortunately a lot of people that are not quite there yet. And you do get pushback. I mean, in general, you get pushback, and you personally get pushback. I know from reading some of the comments on some of the videos you've been on, there are people that don't agree with you and think that you might be kind of an authoritarian or trying to tell people how to think. And unfortunately, that sometimes can have that opposite effect for those people, as you mentioned earlier, that have been going a certain way all their life, that they don't have those tools in place in their mental immunity. And it almost, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do what you do. I mean, I absolutely think it's important. That's why I reached out to you. But it's just one of those things that I guess there's not one singular solution, but it's going to take all of us rational thinkers, like you said, that kind of, I guess, to do our part.
Yeah, that's right. This is a kind of an all hands on deck situation, and we can't expect everyone to like and celebrate what we're trying to do either. There are going to be people who feel threatened by my message, by your message, and who don't see a difference between gently trying to encourage responsible thinking and speech and being an authoritarian about speech. I mean, there are clear differences there, right?
Right.
And in fact, it's not that hard to help someone understand the difference, right? So if someone is using irresponsible reasoning to reach a conclusion that would harm another person's family, you can bet that the second person will care to want to change the first person's way of thinking.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, the fact is, the ways we think and believe can affect the well-being of others.
Right.
We've been living with this kind of half-truth, or perhaps even a falsehood, for a long time, which is that beliefs are private. Everyone's right. Everyone has a right to believe whatever they damn please, because it doesn't have any impact on anybody else. I'm sorry, that's false. Our beliefs impact the well-being of others, and that means other people have a right, an interest in our thinking responsibly and well.
Right. And that touches on a good point in general, which maybe is a good way to kind of close out this conversation, because it sort of gets into the bigger picture aspect of it. There are issues. I mean, we're seeing it right now. It's starting to kind of get into the LGBTQ. We had gay marriage, obviously interracial marriage, and there was a lot of things back in the day that were the norm, societal norms, and they were not right. And those things are, progress demands that things are always going to be moving forward, moving to change. There's always going to be something we can do better at. And I think that that particular perspective, and maybe this is why I was drawn to your book. I think that idea that not everybody necessarily has the right to that irresponsible opinion. that's a minority opinion. I think. I don't think most people agree with that yet, because it's kind of sounds a little bit like authoritarian in a way. I understand what you're saying when you say that. So I get it and I agree with that. But I do think it is one of those things that's not quite a majority opinion yet. It's kind of like how, I mean, physician assisted suicide may not be a majority opinion yet, but it's kind of working towards that direction.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that. I mean, I'm well aware that what I'm saying here is both controversial and can be perceived as sanctioning authoritarian thought police. So I have a whole chapter titled "Thought Police Need Not Apply."
Right.
Look, I'm not in favor of thought police. I do not want any centralized authority telling all the rest of us what to think. I will stand beside every single free thinker out there in doing battle against an Orwellian thought police. And we need gentle, collaborative, constructive ways of weeding out wrong ideas. And the most powerful technique ever invented for that is philosophical idea testing, or the kind of idea testing that Socrates went in for. And there wasn't an authoritarian, there's nothing inherently authoritarian about such idea testing. And in fact, it's needed because otherwise ideas, false and wrong-headed ideas, begin to accumulate in people's minds and turn them into people who are willing to go out and harm other people. And if you recognize that threat, you have to, I think, concede that we can't just let 1,000 cognitive flowers bloom, because some of those flowers will be overrun by weeds. Some of our mental gardens will be overrun with weeds. And some of those weeds will prevent, can do huge damage to our collective prospect.
Right. And that sort of speaks to, you know, one of the things about Joe Rogan's statement about he offered the idea that Spotify might start offering a disclaimer when he has those sort of controversial guests that they don't jive with the norm. They don't jive with like popular opinion of the educated masses, as it were, which I guess is fair. It's good that he's saying that. At the same time, why would you platform someone that you're acknowledging that they don't, it's again, don't get that. Why do you have to get that guy off the corner? Let him be on the corner with his sign and, you know, bring on people that are actually doing their homework on these subjects.
I like your point a lot, Chris. Think about at the beginning of the scientific revolution, when Galileo, who was one of the first people to see that Copernicus was right, that the Earth revolves around the sun, not vice versa. When he first voiced that opinion, Galileo did, he was the outlier, right? He was not, he was outside the scientific consensus. And Joe knows that you need to provide space for dissenting voices. So this is a tricky thing, right? You want to hear dissenting voices so that comfortable, complacent falsehoods don't last forever.
Right.
So I like that Rogan wants to hear dissenting points of view, but not all dissenting views are created equal.
Right.
And he derives a certain amount of popularity, I think, by platforming genuinely outrageous points of view.
Yes. Yeah, that's
right.
Problematic. Right. And that's where it gets into that. That's where I feel like there's a responsibility, because you build your audience off of this sort of method of saying these outlandish things. You know, you're kind of attracting a certain way of thinking. And then you sort of, you recognize, oh, hey, this works. Look at all these followers I'm attributing. I should keep doing what I'm doing. Meanwhile, you have a purported an expert doctor who's saying that ivermectin is an effective response to COVID and that cloth masks don't work. during a global pandemic, like you said earlier, there are some opinions that actually can have tangible effects. And people could have died because of the things they heard on his show.
Oh, it's almost certain that many people died because of the things. I mean, just statistically, it's
Right.
overwhelmingly likely that people have died because Joe provided a platform to McCullough and Malone.
Right.
That might sound like a harsher condemnation than it's intended to. It's
Right.
primarily a remark about the size of his platform and
Right.
the responsibilities that come with it, and just the law of averages, just the
Sure.
rules of probability.
Yeah. Well, Andy, I really appreciate you coming on today. I feel incredibly privileged and honored for you to take your time to talk to me. Um, I hope that we can connect again, and I hope that in some way I can help out with this endeavor to sort of reach out to more people and kind of bring us all into this more rational way of thought.
Thank you, Chris. Well, keeps helping to spread these ideas. I think you're doing. If I had a different upbringing, I might say you're doing God's work, but I'll just say you're doing good work.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you all for catching up with me again. I hope you've enjoyed the interview. The book is Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think. There it is right there. I've already read through it twice. I'm probably going to read it again. It's an excellent read. Please check it out, and have a great rest of your day. And remember, don't be afraid to question the consensus. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this interview, please consider checking out Andy Norman's book, Mental Immunity. As I said, it's a great read. I really enjoyed it. It helped me in my research for my documentary, and it would help me and it will help him. I'm gonna have my little Amazon link down below. If you would click it and purchase it, I would be greatly appreciative of it. Thank you.